The history of London does not begin with grandeur, nor with the certainty of permanence that later centuries might suggest. Its origins are far more modest, rooted in a landscape that long preceded the idea of a city. Before roads were laid, before walls were raised, and before any structured form of governance emerged, the area was defined primarily by its natural features, most notably the River Thames, whose steady flow would later become central to the city's development. In the centuries before Roman arrival, this region was inhabited by Celtic tribes. These communities did not organize themselves into urban centers in the manner of later civilizations. Their settlements were smaller, shaped by local needs and environmental conditions. Life was sustained through agriculture, trade, and a close relationship with the surrounding land. While these societies possessed their own systems of leadership and cultural identity, they did not establish a permanent city at the site that would later become London. The transformation of this landscape began in the 1st century AD, when the expanding Roman Empire turned its attention to Britain. In the year 43 AD, under the authority of Emperor Claudius, Roman forces initiated a full-scale invasion. This was not an isolated military campaign, but part of a broader strategy of territorial expansion, aimed at extending Roman influence and control. The Romans brought with them not only military power, but also a distinct approach to organization and infrastructure. Their conquests were often followed by the establishment of settlements designed to secure control, facilitate trade, and integrate newly acquired territories into the imperial system. It was within this context that the foundations of London were laid. Around 47 AD, the Romans established a settlement along the northern bank of the River Thames. They named it Londinium. The choice of location was deliberate. The Thames provided a navigable route that connected inland regions with the sea, making it an ideal point for trade and transportation. By controlling this crossing, the Romans could regulate movement and strengthen their hold over the surrounding territory. In its earliest form, Londinium was not a large or particularly distinguished settlement. It began as a modest trading post, composed primarily of wooden structures and basic facilities. However, its strategic position quickly contributed to its growth. Merchants were drawn to the area, goods flowed through its markets, and roads were constructed to link it with other parts of Roman Britain. These developments gradually transformed Londinium from a simple outpost into a functioning urban center. The expansion of the settlement was relatively rapid. Within a few decades, it had developed key features characteristic of Roman urban planning. Streets were laid out in organized patterns, public buildings were constructed, and commercial activity increased. The presence of diverse populations, soldiers, traders, administrators, and local inhabitants contributed to a dynamic and evolving community. Londinium was becoming more than a settlement, it was becoming a city. This early period of growth, however, was interrupted by a significant and violent event. In the year 60 AD, a rebellion was led against Roman rule by Boudicca, a figure who had come to occupy a prominent place in the history of Roman Britain. The uprising was widespread and forceful, targeting Roman strongholds across the region. Londinium, despite its growing importance, was not adequately defended at the time. Roman military resources were concentrated elsewhere, and the decision was made to abandon the settlement rather than attempt an unsuccessful defense. This decision left the city exposed. When Boudicca's forces reached Londinium, they destroyed it extensively. Buildings were burned, and much of what had been established in the previous years was reduced to ruin. For many settlements, such destruction would have marked an end. Yet Londinium did not disappear. After the rebellion was suppressed, the Romans returned to the site and began the process of rebuilding. This reconstruction was more deliberate and more robust than the initial establishment. The new Londinium was designed not only for economic activity but also for resilience. Stone replaced wood in many structures, providing greater durability. Public buildings, including baths and administrative centers, were constructed to reflect Roman architectural standards. Most notably, defensive walls were built around the city. These walls served both a practical and symbolic purpose. They offered protection against future threats and signaled the permanence of Roman authority. As reconstruction progressed, Londinium grew in both size and significance. It developed into a major center within Roman Britain, functioning as a hub of commerce, governance, and social life. Its population expanded, and its infrastructure became increasingly sophisticated. The city's importance was no longer limited to its strategic location. It had become an integral part of the Roman provincial system. At its height, Londinium was one of the most prominent cities in the region. It facilitated trade across considerable distances, connecting Britain with other parts of the Roman Empire. Goods, ideas, and people moved through its streets, contributing to a complex and interconnected urban environment. The city embodied many of the characteristics associated with Roman civilization: order, organization, and integration into a larger imperial framework. However, the stability that Londinium experienced during this period was closely tied to the strength of the Roman Empire itself. As long as imperial structures remained intact, the city could rely on their support. When those structures began to weaken, the consequences extended to distant territories, such as Britain. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Roman Empire faced increasing internal and external pressures. Economic difficulties, political instability, and military challenges strained its capacity to maintain control over its provinces. Britain, located at the edge of the empire, became increasingly difficult to govern and defend. Eventually, Roman forces were withdrawn from the region. This withdrawal did not occur as a single event, but as a gradual process, during which administrative and military support diminished. Londinium, which had depended on these systems, was left without the structures that had sustained it. The effects were significant. Trade declined as connections with the broader empire weakened. Public buildings, no longer maintained, began to deteriorate. The population decreased, and the city's role as a center of administration and commerce diminished. While it did not vanish entirely, it ceased to function as a major urban center in the way it had during the height of Roman rule. By the early 5th century, Londinium stood at a critical point in its history. It had risen from a modest trading post to a significant Roman city, only to face decline as the empire that had built it withdrew. The physical structures remained, but the systems that had given them purpose were no longer present. This period did not mark the end of the city's history, but rather the conclusion of its Roman phase. What followed would be shaped by new peoples, new forms of organization, and new challenges. The foundations that had been laid would not disappear, but they would be reinterpreted in ways that reflected changing circumstances. Thus, as the Roman presence faded, the site of Londinium entered a new and uncertain chapter that would eventually lead to transformation, adaptation, and the emergence of a different kind of city. When the Roman administration withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, the transformation of the city once known as Londinium did not occur through a single catastrophic event, but rather through a gradual and complex process of decline. The systems that had sustained urban life, military protection, administrative organization, and long-distance trade were no longer present. In their absence, the structures of the city began to weaken, not only physically but also socially and economically. The population, which had once been supported by the mechanisms of imperial rule, began to diminish. Trade networks that had connected the city to distant parts of the Roman world became increasingly unreliable. Public buildings, once maintained through organized governance, fell into disrepair. Over time, large portions of the city were abandoned, and the rhythms of urban life gave way to something quieter and more uncertain. It would be inaccurate, however, to imagine this period as one of complete desolation. Rather, it was a period of transition, during which older systems faded and new forms of organization slowly emerged. The areas surrounding the former Roman city did not cease to be inhabited, but it no longer functioned as a central urban hub in the way it had under Roman rule. During the following centuries, groups commonly referred to as the Anglo-Saxons established themselves across various regions of Britain. These groups did not immediately reoccupy the old Roman city. Instead, they formed new settlements that reflected their own social and economic structures. One such settlement, known as Londonwic, developed to the west of the abandoned Roman walls. Londonwic emerged as a center of trade and activity, distinct from the earlier Roman model of urban organization. It functioned as a commercial settlement, facilitating exchange between local communities and continental Europe. Archaeological evidence suggests that it was characterized by workshops, marketplaces, and residential areas that supported a growing population. The shift from Londinium to Londonwic illustrates not merely a change in location, but a transformation in the nature of the settlement itself. The reasons for the initial avoidance of the Roman city are not fully certain. It is possible that the physical condition of Londinium made it difficult to reuse. Its infrastructure, designed for a different administrative system, may have been impractical for the needs of the Anglo-Saxon communities. Additionally, the symbolic association of the site with Roman authority may have influenced the decision to establish a new center of activity elsewhere. Despite these changes, the underlying geographical advantages of the area remain significant. The River Thames continued to serve as a vital route for transportation and trade. Over time, this enduring feature would once again draw attention to the strategic importance of the original Roman site. By the 9th century, external pressures began to reshape the region once more. Viking incursions, which had become increasingly frequent and organized, posed a serious threat to settlements throughout Britain. These incursions were not limited to isolated raids. They represented sustained challenges to political and economic stability. Settlements such as Londinium, which lacked substantial defensive structures, were particularly vulnerable. In response to these threats, a significant shift occurred under the leadership of Alfred the Great. Recognizing the strategic necessity of fortified positions, Alfred initiated the reoccupation of the old Roman city. The existing walls of Londinium, though aged, provided a foundation for defense that could be restored and strengthened. This re-established settlement became known as Londonderry. Unlike its predecessor, it was designed with security as a central concern. The restoration of the walls and the reorganization of the city's layout reflected a deliberate effort to create a defensible and sustainable urban center. This marked a turning point in the history of the city, as it once again assumed a position of regional importance. The transition from Londonderry to Londonderry was not merely a relocation. It represented a redefinition of the city's role. While trade remained an essential function, it was now supported by a framework of protection and governance that allowed for greater stability. The presence of fortified walls enabled the population to withstand external threats more effectively, and it reinforced the authority of those who controlled the city. During this period, the influence of Christianity continued to expand throughout the region. Religious institutions played an increasingly prominent role in shaping social and cultural life. Churches were established, and ecclesiastical structures contributed to the organization of the community. The integration of religious authority with political and economic systems added another dimension to the evolving identity of the city. As the Anglo-Saxon period progressed, London developed into a center of both local and regional significance. It was not always the primary seat of power, but it functioned as a place where political authority could be exercised and where economic activity could flourish. Its importance derived not from a single defining characteristic, but from the combination of its strategic location, its fortified structure, and its capacity to adapt to changing circumstances. At the same time, the city remained subject to ongoing challenges. Viking activity did not cease entirely, and the broader political landscape of Britain was characterized by shifting alliances and conflicts. The ability of London to endure these pressures was closely tied to its capacity for adaptation. Each phase of its development reflected a response to specific conditions, rather than a fixed or predetermined path. By the end of the Anglo-Saxon period, the city had undergone a remarkable transformation. From a Roman administrative center to an abandoned settlement, and then to a re-established fortified town, it had demonstrated a capacity for renewal that would become a defining feature of its history. The layers of its past Roman, Anglo-Saxon, and emerging medieval coexisted within its physical and cultural landscape. This continuity, however, did not imply stability in the modern sense. The structures that had been built and rebuilt were still subject to the uncertainties of power and conflict. The city's future would once again be shaped by forces beyond its control. In the year 1066, a decisive moment approached, one that would alter not only the trajectory of London, but also the broader history of England. The arrival of a new ruling power would introduce changes that extended beyond governance, affecting language, architecture, and social organization. The city, which had already experienced cycles of decline and renewal, now stood on the threshold of another transformation. What followed would not simply reshape London. It would redefine it. By the 11th century, the city that had once been known as Londinium and later re-emerged through Anglo-Saxon reconstruction had already endured centuries of change. It had been abandoned, reoccupied, reshaped, and defended under different rulers and systems of governance. Yet despite these transformations, its most decisive change was still ahead. The year 1066 marked a turning point not only in the history of England, but also in the development of London itself. In that year, the political structure of the region was fundamentally altered through conquest. The arrival of William the Conqueror following the Battle of Hastings introduced a new ruling elite, new administrative systems, and a new cultural direction that would permanently reshape the city. The transition of power did not immediately erase the existing urban structure. Instead, it redefined it. London, already an important settlement within the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, now became central to the authority of the new Norman regime. Its strategic position, established over centuries, made it indispensable for governance and control. One of William's earliest and most significant actions was the consolidation of power through fortified structures. Among these, the construction of the Tower of London, formerly known in its earliest form as the White Tower within Tower of London, stood as both a practical fortress and a political symbol. Its presence communicated authority, control, and permanence. It also served as a means of securing the city against rebellion and ensuring loyalty to the new monarchy. Under Norman rule, London began to develop a more structured administrative identity. The introduction of Norman governance brought changes in law, land ownership, and political organization. The city increasingly became a center where royal authority was exercised directly. While earlier periods had seen London function as an important economic and defensive location, it now began to take on a more defined role as a seat of power. Despite these political changes, the economic life of the city continued to expand. Trade remained central to its existence, and its position along the River Thames ensured continued commercial importance. Merchants from across Europe were drawn to the city, contributing to its growth and diversity. Markets expanded, and commercial districts became more established, reflecting the increasing complexity of urban life. Over time, London's population grew, and with it, the physical structure of the city became denser. Streets developed organically around older foundations, blending remnants of Roman planning with Anglo-Saxon growth and Norman restructuring. This layering of historical phases created a city that was not built in a single moment, but accumulated gradually through successive periods of occupation and reconstruction. Religious life also became increasingly significant during this period. The Norman influence strengthened the role of the church, leading to the expansion of ecclesiastical institutions. Monasteries, churches, and cathedrals became prominent features of the urban landscape. These institutions were not only centers of worship, but also of education, record-keeping, and social organization. Their presence reinforced the integration of religious authority into the broader structure of the city. As the 12th and 13th centuries progressed, London continued to grow in importance. It became a focal point for political decision-making, economic exchange, and cultural development. The relationship between the monarchy and the city was complex, often characterized by negotiation and mutual dependence. The crown required the resources and stability that London provided, while the city benefited from royal protection and recognition. At the same time, London was not immune to internal tensions. Periods of unrest occasionally emerged, often related to taxation, governance, or political disputes. These tensions reflected the city's growing significance. As its importance increased, so too did the stakes of its control. One of the most defining developments of this era was the gradual emergence of a recognizable urban identity. London was no longer simply a Roman relic or an Anglo-Saxon trading settlement. It had become a medieval city with its own institutions, traditions, and social structures. Guilds began to form, regulating trade and craftsmanship. Legal systems became more formalized, and civic organization grew more complex. By the end of the medieval period, London had firmly established itself as the principal city of England. Its evolution had been shaped by conquest, adaptation, and continuity. Each historical layer remained embedded within its structure, from Roman foundations to Anglo-Saxon settlements and Norman fortifications. Yet even as it reached this level of stability, the city continued to evolve. Its history was not a sequence of completed stages, but an ongoing process of transformation. The foundations laid in earlier centuries continued to influence its development, while new forces gradually introduced further change. As London entered the later medieval period, it stood as a city defined by both its past and its present. It was a center of power, commerce, and religion, shaped by centuries of continuity and disruption. And yet, its most dramatic transformations were still to come, for beneath its growing stability, new forces, economic expansion, political centralization, and cultural change were already beginning to reshape it once again. By the late medieval period, London had already undergone centuries of transformation. From its Roman foundation as Londinium, through its Anglo-Saxon reconstruction and Norman consolidation, the city had become the most important urban center in England. Yet its development did not stabilize into permanence. Instead, it entered a new phase defined by both rapid growth and severe crisis. One of the most significant forces shaping this period was the expansion of trade. London's position along the River Thames continued to give it a decisive advantage, allowing goods to move efficiently between inland regions and the North Sea. As England's economy became increasingly integrated with continental Europe, London emerged as the central hub through which much of this exchange passed. Merchants from across the continent established connections within the city, contributing to its increasing prosperity and complexity. This economic growth was accompanied by population expansion. As more people moved into London in search of opportunity, the city became increasingly dense. Housing developed in close proximity, often without formal urban planning. Streets became narrow, and living conditions varied significantly between different areas. Wealth and poverty existed in close physical proximity, reflecting the uneven distribution of prosperity within the growing city. However, this period of expansion was repeatedly disrupted by crises that profoundly affected the city's development. Among the most devastating was the outbreak of plague in the mid-14th century. The epidemic, later known as the Black Death, spread rapidly across Europe and reached England with severe consequences. London, as the largest and most connected city in the kingdom, was particularly affected. The population decline was significant. Entire neighborhoods were affected, and the social and economic structure of the city was temporarily destabilized. Labor shortages emerged, altering economic relationships and increasing the bargaining power of surviving workers. Although the immediate impact was catastrophic, the long-term consequences contributed to structural changes in medieval society, including shifts in wages, land use, and labor organization. Despite this devastation, London did not collapse. Instead, it gradually recovered, demonstrating a recurring pattern in its history: destruction followed by renewal. Trade resumed, population levels slowly increased, and urban life continued. The city's capacity to recover from large-scale disruption became one of its defining characteristics. During this same period, the political importance of London continued to grow. It was increasingly recognized not only as an economic center but also as a focal point of royal authority. Monarchs relied on the city for revenue, administrative support, and logistical infrastructure. In return, Londoners sought privileges, protections, and recognition of their civic rights. This relationship was not static but evolved through negotiation and occasional conflict. One of the key institutions that emerged during this time was the growing power of civic governance. The City of London developed its own administrative structures, including elected officials and regulatory systems that governed trade and public order. These institutions allowed the city to function with a degree of autonomy, even as it remained under royal authority. This balance between independence and subordination became a central feature of London's political identity. Religious institutions also continued to play an important role in shaping the city's landscape and social structure. Churches, monasteries, and charitable organizations were deeply integrated into daily life. They provided not only spiritual guidance but also education, healthcare, and social support. The influence of the church was visible both in the physical architecture of the city and in its cultural and moral framework. As the medieval period progressed, London's importance within England became increasingly difficult to ignore. It was no longer simply one city among others, but the dominant urban center of the kingdom. Its economic power, political influence, and cultural significance continued to expand, even as it faced repeated challenges. Yet beneath this growth lay persistent instability. Fires, disease, overcrowding, and political conflict repeatedly disrupted urban life. The city's wooden structures made it particularly vulnerable to fire, while its dense population amplified the spread of disease. These vulnerabilities meant that progress was never linear. Instead, London's development was marked by cycles of expansion, crisis, and rebuilding. By the end of the medieval era, London had firmly established itself as the principal city of England, both in practical and symbolic terms. It was a center of trade, governance, religion, and culture. Its identity had been shaped by centuries of layered history, with Roman, Anglo-Saxon, and Norman influences still embedded within its structure. However, the city was now approaching another decisive transformation. New economic forces, global exploration, and political centralization were beginning to reshape England itself. London, as always, would not remain unchanged by these developments. Instead, it would once again expand, beyond its medieval boundaries, into a city of a new scale, complexity, and global influence. By the early modern period, London had already established itself as the dominant city of England. Its foundations stretched back to Londinium, and its identity had been shaped through centuries of conquest, recovery, and expansion. Yet despite its long history, the city remained structurally fragile, built largely from timber and tightly packed streets, making it vulnerable to disaster. That fragility became undeniable in the year 1666, when one of the most destructive events in the city's history occurred, the Great Fire of London. Beginning in a bakery on Pudding Lane, the fire spread rapidly through the city's dense wooden architecture. Driven by strong winds and limited firefighting capabilities, it consumed large sections of London over several days. The destruction was immense. Thousands of homes were reduced to ash. Churches, markets, and public buildings were destroyed. The medieval structure of the city, which had developed over centuries, was largely erased in the central areas. Yet despite the scale of the devastation, recorded deaths were relatively limited, partly due to the slow spread of evacuation efforts and the fire's movement through property rather than densely occupied areas at night. The aftermath of the fire created both crisis and opportunity. London faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding not only its physical structures, but also its economic and administrative functions. At the same time, the destruction allowed for a reconsideration of how the city should be designed. In the years that followed, reconstruction efforts were led by architects and planners who sought to create a more resilient urban environment. Among them was Christopher Wren, whose work played a central role in reshaping the city's architectural identity. One of the most significant outcomes of this period was the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral, which became a symbol of renewal and continuity after the disaster. The rebuilding process introduced gradual changes in building materials and urban planning. Stone and brick increasingly replaced timber, reducing the risk of future fires spreading on the same scale. Streets were modestly widened in some areas, and regulations concerning construction began to emerge more systematically. However, the reconstruction was not a complete redesign of the city. Instead, it was a layered process, preserving much of the existing street structure while improving resilience where possible. Despite the devastation of 1666, London's importance continued to grow. The city was already becoming a central hub of trade, finance, and governance within a rapidly expanding global context. The late 17th and 18th centuries marked a period of significant economic transformation, as England increasingly engaged in international trade networks that extended far beyond Europe. London became the focal point of this expansion. Its port facilitated the movement of goods, people, and capital. Merchants and financial institutions developed increasingly sophisticated systems to manage trade, insurance, and credit. Over time, the city began to evolve into not only a political center, but also a financial one. During this period, institutions such as the Bank of England were established, reflecting the growing complexity of the national economy. London's role as a center of finance became increasingly important to the stability and expansion of the state. This development marked a shift in the city's identity. It was no longer defined solely by its political or geographical importance, but also by its economic infrastructure. At the same time, population growth continued. The city expanded beyond its traditional medieval boundaries, incorporating surrounding villages and developing new residential districts. This expansion was not always orderly. Industrialization and urban migration led to rapid increases in population density, particularly in poorer districts. Living conditions varied significantly, with wealthier areas benefiting from improved housing and infrastructure, while poorer communities often faced overcrowding and limited sanitation. London's social structure during this period reflected broader changes occurring across Britain. The rise of industrial production, urban labor, and global trade created new economic classes and altered traditional hierarchies. The city became a place where these changes were most visible, concentrated, and intensified. Despite these challenges, London continued to function as the administrative and cultural heart of the country. Government institutions remained centered in and around the city, reinforcing its political significance. Cultural life also flourished, with developments in literature, theater, and intellectual thought contributing to its growing reputation as a center of influence. By the end of this period, London had transformed from a medieval city into an emerging modern metropolis. Its structure reflected centuries of adaptation, rebuilding, and expansion. Each historical layer remained embedded within its geography, From Roman foundations to post-fire reconstruction and early modern growth, yet even as it entered this new phase, the city was already on the threshold of further transformation. The forces of industrialization, empire, and global trade were beginning to reshape it once again, pushing London toward an even larger and more complex future. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, London had entered a period of transformation unlike anything in its earlier history. The foundations laid since its origin as Londinium had carried it through conquest, fire, and reconstruction. But now the city faced a different kind of change, one driven not by invasion or disaster, but by industry, technology, and global economic expansion. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain and spread rapidly throughout the world, fundamentally altered the structure of urban life. London, already the largest city in the country, became one of its primary centers of industrial and commercial activity. Factories, warehouses, and workshops expanded across the urban landscape, reshaping both the physical environment and the rhythm of daily life. This period saw a dramatic increase in population. People migrated from rural areas into the city in search of employment, drawn by the growing demand for labor in manufacturing, shipping, and trade-related industries. As a result, London expanded outward at an unprecedented rate, absorbing surrounding settlements and transforming them into densely populated urban districts. However, this rapid growth came with significant challenges. Urban infrastructure struggled to keep pace with the increasing population. Housing shortages became widespread, and many working-class families lived in overcrowded conditions. Sanitation systems were often inadequate, contributing to public health issues. The contrast between wealthier districts and impoverished neighborhoods became more pronounced, reflecting the broader inequalities of industrial society. At the same time, London's role in global trade expanded significantly. As the British Empire grew, the city became the central hub of imperial administration and international commerce. Goods, resources, and capital flowed through its ports and financial institutions, connecting Britain to territories across Asia, Africa, the Americas, and beyond. This global network reinforced London's position as one of the most important cities in the world. The expansion of infrastructure was a defining feature of this era. Railways were introduced in the 19th century, dramatically changing the way people and goods moved across the city and beyond. Railway stations became major architectural and logistical landmarks, connecting London to the rest of Britain and facilitating further economic integration. The River Thames, which had played a central role since the earliest settlement of Londinium, remained essential to the city's development. However, it also became heavily congested due to industrial activity and shipping traffic. The increase in population and industrial waste led to severe environmental challenges, including water pollution and public health crises. One of the most significant consequences of these conditions was the outbreak of cholera epidemics during the 19th century. These public health crises exposed the urgent need for modern sanitation systems. In response, large-scale engineering projects were undertaken, most notably the development of an extensive sewer system designed to improve hygiene and reduce the spread of disease. These improvements marked a turning point in the modernization of urban infrastructure. During this period, London also became a center of political and cultural influence on a global scale. As the administrative heart of the British Empire, decisions affecting vast regions of the world were coordinated from within the city. Government institutions expanded in size and complexity, reflecting the growing demands of imperial governance. Culturally, London experienced a flourishing of intellectual, artistic, and scientific activity. The city became home to writers, thinkers, and innovators whose work contributed to developments in literature, philosophy, engineering, and the sciences. Institutions such as museums, libraries, and universities expanded, reinforcing London's status as a center of knowledge and culture. Despite its growth and influence, the city continued to face internal challenges. Social inequality remained a persistent issue, with stark differences between affluent districts and impoverished industrial areas. Reform movements emerged in response to these conditions, advocating for improvements in labor rights, housing, education, and public health. By the end of the 19th century, London had become one of the largest and most influential cities in the world. Its expansion was not merely physical, but also economic, political, and cultural. The city had evolved into a complex urban system, deeply connected to global networks of trade and governance. Yet this transformation was not without cost. The rapid pace of industrialization had permanently altered the landscape, creating both opportunities and challenges. London had become a symbol of modern progress, but also of the tensions and inequalities that accompanied it. As the city entered the 20th century, it stood at the center of a rapidly changing world, one shaped by technological advancement, political tensions, and global interconnectedness. And once again, it would be tested by forces far beyond its control. By the beginning of the 20th century, London had already reached a level of global significance unmatched in its earlier history. From its origins as Londinium, through centuries of rebuilding and expansion, it had become a vast industrial and imperial metropolis. Yet this scale of development also meant that, when global conflict arrived, the city stood as a major strategic target. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 marked the beginning of a new and devastating chapter in European history. Although London itself was not the primary battlefield, it was deeply affected by the war's economic and social consequences. The city functioned as a central hub for administration, logistics, and finance supporting the war effort. Factories were redirected toward military production, and large portions of the population were mobilized into service or wartime labor. The war introduced new forms of technological warfare, including aerial attacks, which for the first time made cities like London vulnerable from the sky. Although these early raids were limited compared to later conflicts, they marked a psychological shift in how urban centers understood warfare. The city was no longer protected simply by distance or geography. Following the end of the First World War in 1918, London, like much of Europe, entered a period of recovery. However, this recovery was uneven. Economic instability, housing shortages, and social tensions persisted. The interwar period was marked by both modernization and uncertainty, as the city continued to expand while facing the lingering effects of global conflict. The most severe came with the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. This conflict would bring destruction to London on a scale not seen since the Great Fire of 1666. Unlike previous wars, the capital itself became a direct target of sustained aerial bombardment. The period known as the Blitz saw the Blitz carried out by German forces against British cities, with London as the primary target. Night after night, air raids struck the city, causing widespread destruction to residential areas, infrastructure, and cultural landmarks. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Fires spread rapidly through damaged districts. The population faced continuous danger, often taking shelter in underground stations and improvised shelters. Despite the scale of destruction, daily life continued under extreme conditions. Essential services remained operational where possible, and the city adapted to the reality of sustained warfare. One of the defining features of this period was the resilience of the civilian population. Despite repeated attacks, London did not collapse. Instead, it maintained administrative continuity and continued to function as the political center of Britain throughout the war. This endurance became a symbol of national resistance and collective determination. Strategic responses to the bombing campaign included improved air defenses, coordinated civil protection measures, and the dispersal of critical infrastructure. Over time, these efforts reduced the effectiveness of the attacks, but not before significant damage had already been inflicted on the urban landscape. When the war ended in 1945, London faced the immense challenge of reconstruction once again. Large areas of the city required rebuilding. Housing shortages became more severe due to wartime destruction and population displacement. The post-war period therefore focused heavily on urban planning, redevelopment, and modernization. New architectural approaches began to emerge during this time. Some districts were rebuilt in modern styles, reflecting changes in architectural philosophy and urban design. Public housing projects were introduced to address shortages and improve living conditions. At the same time, efforts were made to preserve historical structures that had survived the war, maintaining continuity with the city's past. The post-war decades also marked a shift in London's global role. The gradual decline of the British Empire altered the city's political and economic position. While it remained a major financial center, its identity transitioned from imperial capital to modern, global city within an increasingly interconnected international system. Immigration became an important factor in shaping the city's demographic and cultural landscape. People from across former British territories and beyond moved to London, contributing to its diversity and redefining its social structure. This transformation enriched the cultural life of the city while also introducing new social dynamics and challenges. By the mid to late 20th century, London had been rebuilt once again, physically, socially, and economically. It had endured world wars, sustained heavy destruction, and undergone major structural change. Yet throughout each of these crises, it continued to function as a central urban hub. The city that emerged from this period was not identical to any earlier version of itself. It was no longer imperial in the same sense, nor purely industrial, nor medieval in structure. Instead, it had become something more complex, a modern global metropolis shaped by layers of historical transformation. As the 20th century progressed, new forces, global finance, cultural globalization, and technological advancement would continue to reshape London once more, carrying it into a new era of influence and complexity. In the second half of the 20th century, London entered a new phase of transformation that differed fundamentally from its earlier periods of rebuilding. Unlike the changes driven by conquest, fire, or industrial revolution, the stage was shaped by globalization, financial restructuring, and rapid technological advancement. The city, already rebuilt after the destruction of the Second World War, now began to redefine its role within an increasingly interconnected world. The post-war decades had left London in a state of transition. Large-scale reconstruction projects had reshaped parts of the urban landscape, introducing modernist architecture alongside surviving historical structures. At the same time, the decline of the British Empire had fundamentally altered the city's global position. No longer the administrative center of a vast imperial system, London had to adapt to a new identity within a changing international order. During the 1970s and 1982, a significant shift occurred in the city's economic structure. Traditional manufacturing industries, which had once played a central role in urban employment, began to decline. Factories closed or moved outside the city, leading to changes in employment patterns and urban development. In their place, financial services, banking, and global trade networks became increasingly dominant. This transformation marked the emergence of London as a leading global financial center. Institutions such as banks, insurance companies, and investment firms expanded their presence, particularly in areas such as the City of London and later Canary Wharf. These districts became symbolic of the city's new economic identity, characterized by high-rise developments, corporate headquarters, and international connectivity. Technological advancement played a crucial role in this transformation. Improvements in communication systems, computing, and global transportation allowed financial markets to operate at unprecedented speed and scale. London, with its established legal framework and historical significance as a commercial hub, was well positioned to benefit from these developments. At the same time, the city's population continued to evolve. Immigration remained a defining feature of London's identity, particularly after the mid-20th century. People from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean contributed to the city's cultural diversity, shaping its neighborhoods, traditions, and social life. This diversity became one of London's most distinctive characteristics, influencing its cuisine, language, arts, and public culture. Urban development during this period reflected both continuity and change. While historic districts were preserved, new architectural projects reshaped the skyline. The contrast between older stone structures and modern glass towers became a visible representation of the city's layered history. Each architectural phase, Roman, medieval, industrial, and modern, remained present in different forms across the urban landscape. Transport infrastructure also underwent significant modernization. The expansion of rail networks, the development of underground systems, and improvements in international airports strengthened London's connectivity. These systems supported the city's growing role as a global hub for commerce, tourism, and communication. Culturally, London experienced a period of international prominence. It became a center for music, fashion, literature, and the arts. Creative industries flourished, attracting talent from around the world. The city's cultural output increasingly reflected its diversity, blending local traditions with global influences. Despite its economic and cultural success, London also faced ongoing challenges. Housing affordability, social inequality, and infrastructure pressure became increasingly significant issues. Rapid population growth placed strain on public services and urban planning systems. These challenges reflected the broader complexities of managing a rapidly expanding global city. Political and administrative structures adapted to these changes. Governance became more decentralized in some respects, with greater emphasis on regional planning and local administration. At the same time, London's role as the capital of the United Kingdom ensured its continued importance in national decision-making. By the end of the 20th century, London had fully established itself as a global city. Its influence extended far beyond national borders, connecting financial systems, cultural networks, and political relationships across continents. Yet this global status was not a departure from its past, but rather a continuation of a long historical trajectory. From its origins as Londinium, through centuries of reconstruction and reinvention, London had repeatedly adapted to new circumstances. Each era left its imprint on the city, creating a layered identity that combined continuity with transformation. As the 21st century began, London stood at the center of a rapidly changing world, one shaped by digital technology, globalization, and shifting political dynamics. And once again, the city would face new challenges that would test its ability to adapt, as it had done throughout its entire history. As the 21st century began, London entered a new historical phase shaped by globalization, digital transformation, and shifting political and economic realities. Having already evolved from its origins as Londinium into a medieval center, an industrial powerhouse, and a post-war global capital, the city now faced challenges that were no longer primarily physical, but systemic and international in scale. One of the defining features of this period was the deepening of London's role as a global financial center. The institutions that had expanded during the late 20th century became even more integrated into international markets. Banking, investment, insurance, and financial services increasingly defined the economic identity of the city. Districts such as the City of London and Canary Wharf functioned not only as national financial hubs, but as nodes in a global economic network that operated continuously across time zones. However, this economic strength also created structural vulnerabilities. The 2008 global financial crisis had a significant impact on London, exposing the interconnected risks within international banking systems. While the city ultimately recovered, the crisis revealed the extent to which its economy depended on global financial stability. In the aftermath, regulatory frameworks were strengthened, and financial institutions underwent restructuring, but the central role of London in global finance remained unchanged. Alongside its financial importance, London continued to expand culturally and demographically. Immigration remained a key factor in shaping the city's population. People from across Europe and beyond contributed to its social fabric, reinforcing its identity as one of the most diverse cities in the world. This diversity was reflected in language, cuisine, religion, and cultural expression, making London a unique intersection of global communities. At the same time, rapid population growth intensified pressure on housing, infrastructure, and public services. Rising property prices and cost of living became central concerns for residents. The gap between wealth and inequality remained a persistent issue, particularly in relation to access to housing and economic opportunity. These challenges highlighted the tension between global economic success and local social stability. Technological transformation further reshaped the city during this period. The rise of digital communication, data-driven industries, and online platforms changed the way people worked, interacted, and conducted business. London adapted by integrating technology into its financial systems, governance structures, and service industries. It also became a major hub for technology startups and innovation-driven companies, particularly in sectors linked to artificial intelligence, fintech, and digital media. Urban development continued to evolve in response to these pressures. The city's skyline expanded with new high-rise buildings, reflecting both economic growth and architectural modernization. At the same time, preservation efforts ensured that historical landmarks remained central to the city's identity. This ongoing balance between preservation and development remained one of London's defining characteristics. Transportation infrastructure also underwent modernization. The expansion of rail systems, improvements to underground networks, and upgrades to international airports strengthened the city's connectivity. Projects aimed at increasing capacity and reducing congestion reflected the demands of a rapidly growing metropolitan population. Culturally, London maintained its position as a global center for the arts. Theater, music, fashion, literature, and visual arts continued to flourish. The city's cultural industries benefited from its diversity, attracting international talent and audiences. Major institutions and smaller independent creative spaces coexisted, contributing to a dynamic and evolving cultural environment. Despite these strengths, London faced significant challenges in the 21st century. Issues such as housing shortages, inequality, environmental sustainability, and infrastructure strain became increasingly prominent. Climate change also emerged as a long-term concern, influencing urban planning and policy decisions. Flood management, energy efficiency, and sustainable development became important areas of focus for the city's future. Political developments also influenced London's trajectory. The city remained at the center of national decision-making in the United Kingdom, while also responding to broader global political shifts. Events such as changes in international trade, relationships, and political realignments had direct and indirect effects on the city's economy and identity. One of the most significant recent developments was the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union. This political change introduced new uncertainties regarding trade, migration, and regulatory frameworks. While London retained its global importance, it also faced questions about its future position within European and international systems. Adaptation once again became a defining feature of the city's response. Through all of these developments, one pattern remained consistent. London continued to evolve not through sudden transformation alone, but through gradual accumulation of change layered upon centuries of history. The Roman foundations of Londinium remained beneath modern infrastructure. Medieval street patterns still influenced parts of the city's layout. Industrial expansion and post-war reconstruction remained visible in its architecture and urban structure. By the early 21st century, London had become a city defined by complexity. It was at once historical and modern, local and global, traditional and rapidly changing. Its identity was not fixed, but continuously shaped by the interaction of its past and present. As the city moved further into the digital age, it stood once again at a moment of transition. New technologies, environmental challenges, and global shifts continued to reshape its trajectory. And as with every previous era in its long history, London's future would depend on its ability to adapt while carrying the weight of its past forward into what comes next. The history of London is not a story that concludes in any single era, nor does it reach a final state of completion. From its earliest formation as Londinium, through centuries of abandonment, reconstruction, conquest, industrial expansion, global war, and modern transformation, the city has consistently demonstrated a pattern that defines it more than any single event: continuity through change. By the early decades of the 21st century, London stands as one of the most historically layered cities in the world. Its physical landscape contains visible traces of nearly every major phase of its development. Roman foundations lie beneath modern streets. Medieval boundaries influence present-day districts. Industrial-era infrastructure remains embedded within modern transport systems. Post-war reconstruction and contemporary architecture exist side by side, forming a city that is not the product of a single moment in time, but of many overlapping histories. What distinguishes London from many other global cities is not simply its size, wealth, or political importance, but the depth of its accumulated history. Each era has not replaced the previous one entirely. Instead, it has been added upon it. This layering effect has created a city that is constantly evolving while still retaining visible connections to its past. In the present day, London continues to function as a major global center for finance, culture, education, and governance. Its institutions are deeply integrated into international systems, and its influence extends far beyond the borders of the United Kingdom. Yet this global role exists alongside persistent internal challenges. Issues such as housing pressure, economic inequality, infrastructure demands, and environmental sustainability remain central to the city's ongoing development. At the same time, technological change continues to reshape how the city operates. Digital infrastructure, artificial intelligence, data systems, and global communication networks are increasingly embedded into both public and private life. These developments are not external to London's identity. They are now part of the process through which the city continues to evolve. Demographically, London remains one of the most diverse cities in the world. Its population is composed of communities originating from across Europe, Africa, Asia, the Americas, and beyond. This diversity is not a recent phenomenon, but an extension of long historical patterns of migration and exchange. Over time, it has become one of the defining characteristics of the city's cultural identity, influencing language, food, art, religion, and daily life. Yet even as London embraces modernity, it continues to preserve its historical memory. Landmarks, museums, archives, and architectural conservation efforts ensure that earlier periods of its history remain visible and accessible. The coexistence of ancient, medieval, industrial, and modern elements within a single urban environment is one of the most distinctive features of the city. From a broader historical perspective, London can be understood not as a finished creation, but as an ongoing process. Each period in its development has been shaped by both internal dynamics and external forces: conquest, trade, migration, war, technology, and globalization. These forces have never acted in isolation, but have continually interacted to produce new forms of urban life. The endurance of London is therefore not the result of permanence in a static sense, but of adaptation. At every stage of its history, when faced with destruction, decline, or transformation, the city has reconfigured itself rather than disappearing. This pattern can be traced from the abandonment of Roman Londinium, to the Anglo-Saxon reoccupation, to Norman restructuring, to industrial expansion, and to modern globalization. Even in the present, this process remains ongoing. The city continues to respond to new challenges and opportunities, adjusting its structures, systems, and identity in response to changing global conditions. There is no indication in its history of a final or fixed form, only continuous evolution. Thus, the history of London is best understood not as a completed narrative, but as a continuing one. It is a city defined less by what it has been, and more by its capacity to become something new while still retaining the imprint of everything it has been before. And in that sense, the story of London does not end here. It continues, layer by layer, generation by generation, shaped by the same forces that have guided it since the first settlement along the River Thames, and still unfolding into an uncertain but ongoing future. Now, we are at the end of the video. If you have stayed with this documentary until this moment, then you have not simply watched a video. You have journeyed through centuries. Producing a piece like this takes time, research, and careful effort. So if you found value in it, support the work behind it. Take a moment to like the video, share it with others who appreciate history, and subscribe to the channel for more documentaries like this. And most importantly, don't leave silently. Your thoughts matter.